The market square of Terexis Minor smelled like a dozen different worlds had gotten together and decided to make lunch simultaneously. Kai Reeves had spent 3 years learning to love that smell. The sharp tang of Vorlathi spice bread mixing with the sweet burn of Centauri coffee analogs, the earthy scent of human vegetables grown in alien soil. And today, the particular aroma of Thuris's cinnamon rolls that weren't quite cinnamon and weren't quite rolls, but were close enough to make him homesick in a good way. Sergeant Reeves, Thuris called from his stall, all 4 arms managing different tasks simultaneously in a way that still made Kai's brain hurt. You are early today, yes. The patrol does not start for another hour. I couldn't sleep, Kai admitted, accepting the pastry thing that Thuris insisted on giving him despite his protests about paying. Too quiet, makes me nervous. Quiet is good. Quiet means no creche, no pirates, no trouble. Thuris's upper arms kneaded dough, while his lower arms arranged display items with the kind of precision that came from 40 years of running a bakery. You humans, always looking for problems when there are none. It's called paranoia, keeps us alive. It keeps you anxious, not the same thing, my friend. The alarms cut through the morning like a knife through silk, and Kai's coffee hit the ground before his conscious mind even registered. He dropped it. 3 years on Terexis Minor meant the sound was burned into his nervous system. Code black, the worst possible scenario, the sound that meant everything was about to go catastrophically wrong. His comm unit screamed to life with overlapping voices, commanders trying to coordinate, soldiers reporting positions, and underneath it all the distinctive crackle of weapons fire that was getting closer by the second. All units code black. Creche assault, multiple vectors, central district is primary target. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Kai was already running. Behind him, he could hear Thuris beginning the evacuation protocols. His multiple arms now herding customers toward the shelters with practiced efficiency that came from too many drills and one very real attack 2 years ago that had killed 17 colonists before the defense forces could respond. 3 years on Terexis Minor meant everyone knew the drills. 3 years also meant everyone knew the creche didn't usually hit this deep into settled territory, which meant someone had screwed up the intelligence badly or the creche had changed their tactical doctrine. Neither option was comforting. Squad 7, Rally Point Gamma. His unit commander's voice crackled through increasing static. We need to establish defensive positions at Junction Point 7. The evacuation routes are converging there, and we cannot let them. The transmission dissolved into white noise as something hit the communications grid hard enough that Kai felt it through his boots. A pressure wave that made his teeth ache and his inner ear protest. EMP burst, his training supplied automatically. They'd taken out the network first, standard creche tactical doctrine when they actually planned an assault instead of just raiding. Cut communications, create chaos, overwhelm through coordinated strikes while the defenders struggled to organize. This wasn't a raid. This was an invasion. He reached his armory locker at a full sprint, his fingers working the combination lock through muscle memory while his mind was already 3 steps ahead, calculating routes to Junction Point 7 and odds of survival that were getting worse by the second. Rifle, charged and ready, the familiar weight settling into his hands like an old friend. Sidearm for backup, because if things got bad enough that he needed the sidearm, he was probably already dead but might as well take a few more with him. Ammunition that suddenly seemed woefully inadequate when he did the math on how many creche could hit a colony this size. Emergency beacon that might not reach anyone if the entire grid was down. The sky outside had changed. No longer the pleasant blue of a frontier morning with its twin suns just climbing toward zenith. Now it was streaked with contrails from drop ships and the crackling discharge of creche bioweapons that left ozone scars in the air. Kai could see them now through the armory's windows. Insectoid forms descending in organized waves, their chitinous armor reflecting the sunlight like living obsidian. Their movements coordinated with the kind of precision that spoke of hive mind intelligence working at peak efficiency. He'd fought the Kresh before. Small skirmishes, border conflicts, the kind of engagements where both sides tested each other's resolve without committing to full warfare. He'd never seen them commit like this, hundreds, maybe thousands, coming down in organized assault patterns that spoke of serious tactical planning and resources dedicated to taking this colony specifically. Reeves. That was Corporal Nash, appearing from around a corner with two other squad members, their faces showing the same calculation Kai had just finished. This was bad. This was worse than bad. This was the kind of situation that ended with a lot of flag-draped coffins and memorial services. Junction Point 7 is compromised. Chen's team was supposed to hold it, but they got hit by a cluster strike during the initial descent. Command wants us to. Another EMP burst, and this time Kai felt it in his fillings. A pressure wave that made his rifle's targeting system flicker ominously, and his combat computer reboot with error messages scrolling across his HUD faster than he could read them. When it came back online, half his tactical displays were dead, and his communication link was reduced to static and occasional words that might have been orders or might have been someone's last transmission. "Where's the rest of the squad?" Kai shouted over the sounds of combat getting closer, the distinctive whine of Kresh bioweapons, the deeper boom of human defense batteries, and underneath it all the sound of buildings collapsing as the battle consumed the colony's outer districts. "Scattered. The initial assault hit us during rotation shift change. Half the unit was off duty in the barracks when the first strike hit." And Nash's eyes went wide, and Kai spun to see a Kresh warrior cresting the rooftop behind them, its bioweapon already charging with that distinctive rising whine that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. They scattered. Training took over. Never bunch up. Never give them an easy target. Make them choose who to shoot first and use that moment to kill them. Kai fired as he ran, controlled bursts that probably didn't hit anything vital but made the Kresh adjust its aim enough that Nash and the others could reach cover. The warrior returned fire, bioelectric bolts that left scorch marks on the pavement where Kai had been standing a second before, the heat from near misses singeing his exposed skin. "Fall back to secondary positions." Nash ordered, and Kai's tactical computer agreed even through its damaged state. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and staying here meant dying here without accomplishing anything useful. But then Kai saw the civilians. They were flooding out of the residential sectors like a dam had broken, heading for the evacuation points that had been drilled into every colonist from their first day on Terexis Minor. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Humans, Vorlathi, Centauri, species he didn't even have names for, all running with the universal panic of people who knew death was chasing them, and speed was the only thing standing between them and oblivion. And they were all converging on Junction Point 7, the nexus where three major evacuation routes met, where the transports would be waiting to carry them to orbit and safety. The nexus that was now undefended because Chen's team was dead. Kai's combat computer, struggling through its damaged state, helpfully informed him that at current Kresh advance rates, the enemy would reach Junction Point 7 in approximately 4 minutes. The evacuation transports needed at least 8 minutes to complete their loading cycles. He knew this because he'd helped design the evacuation protocols, had sat through boring meetings about load capacities and engine warm-up times, and all the tedious logistics that suddenly mattered more than anything in the world. The math was simple and terrible. 4 minutes until the Kresh arrived. 8 minutes until the transports could lift off. 4 minutes of absolutely nothing standing between thousands of civilians and an enemy that didn't take prisoners. Reeves' move. Nash was already falling back, following orders, doing the tactically sound thing that would keep him alive to fight from better positions with proper support. Kai looked at the civilians streaming toward Junction Point 7, looked at his rifle's ammunition counter. 6 magazines, Maybe 6 minutes of sustained fire if he was careful and conservative and very, very lucky. He'd never been particularly lucky, but he'd always been stubborn. Go. He shouted to Nash. Get to secondary positions, coordinate with whoever's still alive, I'll hold here. That's suicide, you can't hold against what's coming. I can hold for 8 minutes. Now move, Corporal, that's an order. The rank difference was negligible. Kai had maybe 6 months seniority. But Nash's training kicked in anyway. The reflexive obedience to orders even when those orders were obviously insane. Nash stared at him for one long second, and Kai saw understanding bloom in his eyes. Understanding and pity and respect all tangled together, in an expression that said Nash knew exactly what Kai was doing, and exactly how it was going to end. Then Nash was gone, taking the other two with him, leaving Kai alone at junction point 7 as the civilians streamed past, and the creche closed in like a living tide of chitin and hatred. He set up position behind what used to be a decorative fountain in the plaza, using the broken stonework as cover. The fountain had been a gift from the Vorlathi community, carved with symbols of peace and prosperity that now seemed bitterly ironic. His rifle scope showed him exactly how bad the situation was. Hundreds of creche, moving with insectoid precision through the ruined streets, their weapons crackling with bioelectric fury, and every single one of them heading straight for his position and the defenseless civilians behind it. Behind him, he could hear the transport engines powering up, that distinctive rising whine of engines designed to carry people to orbit, to safety, to anywhere but here. He could hear parents calling for children in a dozen languages, could hear the distinctive sound of Thurus's voice organizing people with the same efficiency he brought to making breakfast pastries, could hear someone crying and someone else trying to comfort them. Kai checked his rifle one more time, a gesture more ritual than practical at this point. He said a prayer to gods he wasn't sure he believed in, asked them to make his aim true and his ammunition last, and maybe, just maybe, let him buy enough time. Then he took a deep breath, settled into firing position, and opened fire on an enemy that outnumbered him 100 to 1. The first wave hit his kill zone and died there. The narrow approach to the junction forced them to bunch up. The colony's designers had probably been thinking about traffic flow, but it made for excellent defensive terrain. Kai used every trick his instructors had ever taught him. Controlled bursts to conserve ammunition, priority targeting on the warriors with heavy weapons, constant repositioning to make them think he was multiple defenders coordinating fire. Bodies fell. Chitin cracked under kinetic impacts. Bioweapons discharged into empty air where Kai had been a second before. And for 30 glorious seconds, he actually thought he might pull this off, might actually hold long enough, might actually save them all. Then the second wave arrived, and the third and the fourth, and suddenly 30 seconds felt like a lifetime ago, and Kai was burning through ammunition faster than he'd planned because there were just so many of them and they kept coming, and his rifle was overheating, and his position was being flanked, and behind him the transports were still loading, still not ready, still needing more time. His rifle's cooling system failed with a warning tone that sounded apologetic. He switched to his sidearm, knowing he was down to his last line of defense, knowing the math had shifted from maybe to definitely not, but still firing because behind him, the transports were still loading, and every second mattered, and he'd promised himself 8 minutes, and he was going to deliver 8 minutes even if it killed him, which it absolutely was going to do. A creche warrior broke through his defensive line, moving with terrifying speed, its bioweapon raised and aimed directly at his head. Kai had just enough time to think that at least he'd bought them enough time. At least the civilians made it. At least his death meant something. At least he could face whatever came next knowing he'd done everything possible. The world exploded in golden light. Kai's combat-shocked brain tried to process what was happening and failed completely. The creche warrior that had been about to kill him was frozen mid-strike, its weapon still raised but held back by a barrier of pure force that shimmered like captured starlight, like someone had taken the concept of impenetrable and made it visible. And standing between him and certain death was a woman whose presence felt like gravity itself had shifted to acknowledge her importance. She wore armor that seemed to be made of liquid metal and solidified light simultaneously, constantly flowing across her body in patterns that hurt to look at directly, responding to movements he couldn't predict. Her hair was dark, pulled back in an intricate style that was both practical for combat and elegant enough for a formal ceremony. Her ears, long and gracefully pointed, marked her as Stellarium, one of the ancient species whose empires had existed when humanity was still figuring out fire and trying to decide if agriculture was worth the effort. And her eyes, when she glanced back at him with an expression he couldn't read, glowed with power that made his rifle seem like a child's toy. Like someone had taken all the energy of a star and compressed it into something that could fit in a person's skull and use it to stare judgmentally at Kresh warriors. "You," she said in perfect English, her voice carrying harmonics that his translator couldn't quite capture, undertones that spoke of authority so absolute it didn't need to be stated, "are either remarkably brave or catastrophically stupid." Kai's brain, still desperately trying to catch up with not being dead, managed, "Can it be both?" Despite everything, the battle still raging, the danger still present, the hundreds of Kresh warriors now staring at them with what might have been shock or might have been the hive mind equivalent of existential crisis, she almost smiled. It was brief, barely a twitch at the corner of her mouth, but it was there. "Stay behind me, human," she said, turning back to face the Kresh army with casual confidence that suggested she'd done this before and found it mildly tedious. "I suspect your fight isn't quite finished." And as the Empress of the Stellarium Ascendancy raised her hand and reality itself bent to her will, as barriers of pure force exploded outward and through Kresh warriors like leaves before a storm, as golden light flooded the plaza and turned certain death into impossible salvation, Kai Reeves realized that his life had just become infinitely more complicated. High above Terexis Minor, aboard the sovereign vessel Eternal Radiance, High Chancellor Vanirus was experiencing what humans might call a panic attack, though Stellarium physiology expressed it through rapidly cycling ear positions, stress pheromones that made nearby crew members uncomfortable, and a voice that climbed into registers usually reserved for mating calls or extreme distress. The bridge crew was trying very hard not to stare at him, but it was difficult when their second-in-command was essentially having a very public breakdown. "Your Majesty has descended." He managed, his voice doing things that violated several principles of Stellarium vocal control. "To a battlefield, personally, in combat configuration, without consulting the Council, without proper security protocols, without even informing her advisors that she was about to do something that will create a diplomatic incident of catastrophic proportions." The junior officer who delivered this catastrophic news nodded miserably, his own ears pressed so flat against his skull that they were practically invisible. "Approximately 43 seconds ago, Chancellor, the Empress activated her sovereign armor and teleported directly into active combat on the planet's surface. Telemetry shows she's engaged with approximately 300 Kresh warriors in the central plaza of the colony's primary settlement." Vanirus made a sound that the translator diplomatically rendered as profound concern, but which was actually closer to the career-ending scream of someone who definitely should have seen this coming, and is now imagining explaining to the High Council why he allowed the Empress to risk her life for a colonial skirmish on a backwater world. "Prepare immediate extraction teams," he ordered, his voice settling back into something resembling professional competence through sheer force of will. "Combat configuration, full sovereign guard, and someone find me a threat assessment that explains how 300 Kresh became worth risking the life of the most powerful person in the Ascendancy." On the planet below, Lysandra was discovering that fighting alongside a human was very different from the tactical simulations she'd studied. The simulations, prepared by advisors who'd never actually met a human in combat, suggested they were reckless, impulsive, tactically unsound, prone to emotional decision-making that got them killed. What the simulations had failed to capture was the way this particular human immediately understood her combat style and adapted to complement it with efficiency that spoke of real battlefield experience rather than academic theory. "Left flank!" Kai shouted, and she pivoted without thinking, barriers forming exactly where he'd indicated just in time to catch a cluster of Kresh warriors mid-charge. They hit her force wall like insects hitting a transport windshield, the impact dispersing across the barrier's surface in patterns of golden light. "Above, 3 o'clock!" she called back, and he fired immediately, his primitive kinetic weapon somehow dropping a Kresh that was attempting an aerial approach from an angle her barriers didn't cover. The warrior fell with a shriek that was equal parts pain and surprise, crashing into two of its fellows and creating a momentary gap in their formation. They fell into rhythm without discussing it, without planning, just pure reactive combat instinct finding synchronization, her power providing defense and overwhelming force, his tactical knowledge directing that power where it mattered most. The Kresh, faced with sovereign-level opposition they couldn't possibly counter, and a human who refused to die despite all logical probability, began to falter. Lysandra had been in combat before. Not often. Empresses rarely needed to personally fight, that's what armies were for, but enough times to know what battlefield coordination felt like. This was different. This was two completely different combat philosophies, evolved on different worlds under different pressures, somehow meshing into something that was more effective than either would have been alone. When the last evacuation transport lifted off, its engine screaming as it carried refugees to safety, the distinctive sound cutting through the noise of combat, the battlefield went suddenly, eerily quiet. The Kresh, realizing they'd lost their tactical objective and were now facing opposition that included actual sovereign power, began a fighting retreat. They didn't run. The hive mind didn't really do panic, but they withdrew with the same organized precision they'd used to attack, disappearing into the ruined colony with efficiency that suggested they'd be back when they had better intelligence about what they were actually facing. Within minutes, the plaza was empty except for bodies, debris, and two unlikely allies standing amid the wreckage of what had been a peaceful morning market just an hour ago. Kai's armor finally gave out, systems failing, damage warnings scrolling across his HUD in angry red, structural integrity compromised by near misses, and one direct hit that should have killed him but somehow only cracked his chest plate. He collapsed to one knee, and Lysandra caught him before he fell completely, her strength surprising him even through the sovereign armor that should have made her movements clumsy, but somehow didn't. "Easy, soldier," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle for someone who just single-handedly held off an army. "You've earned rest." "You're the Empress," Kai said, the realization finally breaking through his combat-shocked mind like sunlight through clouds. "The actual Empress, of the Stellarium Ascendancy. The being whose likeness is on half the currency in this sector. You're on a battlefield saving me, personally." "It would appear so," she said, and there was something in her voice that might have been amusement or might have been her own form of shock at what she'd just done. "Your advisors are going to be furious." "Undoubtedly." She helped him to his feet, supporting his weight with ease that spoke of strength that had nothing to do with the armor. "Though I suspect furious is an understatement. High Chancellor Vainirus is probably experiencing some form of stress-induced medical crisis as we speak." Above them, the eternal radiance was descending in what the crew would later describe in official reports as controlled panic mode, and in private conversations as that time, the bridge crew thought they were all going to be executed for allowing the Empress to do something insane. Kai could see figures in the landing bay who looked very concerned and very important, and very much like they were preparing to have very serious conversations about very serious topics. "Why?" Kai asked simply, because his brain was too exhausted for complex sentences, and this seemed like the most important question in the universe right now. Lysandra was quiet for a long moment, her golden eyes studying his face with an intensity that made him feel like she was reading his entire life story from the scars and dirt and exhaustion written across his features. Because I've spent 40 cycles making calculated decisions, weighing costs against benefits, choosing the logical path that serves the greatest number. And in 6 minutes, watching you fight alone for people you had no obligation to protect, you reminded me that some things transcend calculation. That courage without expectation of reward still exists. That there are people who value all lives equally, regardless of species or political alignment or strategic importance. The ship landed with precisely controlled descent that spoke of pilots who were very good at their jobs and very aware that they were being watched by someone who could end their careers with a word. Very agitated advisors swarmed out, their expressions cycling between relief at seeing their Empress alive, horror. "This isn't over, Sergeant Reeves," she said quietly. Her words meant only for him despite the crowd of advisors pretending not to listen. "What we began here, it's going to have consequences neither of us can predict. For you, for me, for the relationship between our peoples. I hope you're prepared for that." Kai, exhausted and still processing everything that had happened in the last hour, everything that had changed between planning to die alone and standing here talking to literal royalty, managed a weak salute that was probably incorrect by Stellarium standards, but was the best he could offer. "Looking forward to it, ma'am." And despite everything, despite the political crisis waiting for her aboard that ship, despite the advisors already preparing their objections and arguments and very serious concerns, despite the certain knowledge that she just made her life infinitely more complicated, Lysandra smiled. It was brief, barely visible, but it was genuine. Then she was gone, boarding her ship with royal grace, leaving Kai alone in the ruins of Junction Point 7 with the bodies of enemies he'd killed and civilians he'd saved, and the growing awareness that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't begin to comprehend. 3 days later, Kai found himself in a situation far more terrifying than facing the creche. He'd been summoned to the Eternal Radiance for diplomatic consultations, which he suspected was code for explain to a bunch of very important aliens why their Empress risked her life for you, and try not to say anything that causes an interstellar incident. The transition from frontier soldier to diplomatic guest was jarring in ways that combat never was. He'd been given quarters that were larger than his entire barracks back on Terexis Minor, with furniture that adapted to human physiology in ways that suggested someone had done serious research, and clothing that adjusted to his body temperature automatically and probably cost more than his yearly salary. An aide had been assigned to him, a nervous young stellarium named Kesvi, whose ears twitched constantly with barely suppressed anxiety, and who seemed torn between being helpful and being terrified that Kai would somehow break something priceless just by existing near it. "The High Council wishes to speak with you," Kesvi informed him on his second day aboard, his long ears twitching with what Kai was learning to recognize as extreme stress. "It's quite an honor. They don't usually grant audiences to," he stopped himself, ears pressing flat in embarrassment, "to random human soldiers who accidentally caused a political crisis." Kai finished for him because there was no point in pretending they both didn't know exactly what this was about. "I was going to say to individuals outside the normal diplomatic channels, but yes, essentially that." Kesvi produced a data pad that displayed information in Stellarium script that Kai couldn't read. "I've prepared briefing materials on proper council protocol, forms of address, acceptable topics of conversation, and a list of things you absolutely should not mention under any circumstances." "How long is that list?" "Quite long. Would you like me to summarize, or would you prefer the detailed version with historical context explaining why each item is forbidden?" "Summary, please. My brain is still recovering from being shot at." The council chamber was designed to intimidate, and it succeeded admirably. Vast spaces that seemed to stretch into impossible distances, crystalline architecture that grew from the walls like frozen waterfalls, and seating arranged in tiers that made the person standing at the center feel very small and very observed. Kai stood in that center, acutely aware that he was wearing his dress uniform, hastily cleaned after the battle, still showing scorch marks that no amount of treatment could completely remove, while surrounded by beings in robes that probably had their own historical significance and were definitely worth more than everything he owned. High Chancellor Vanirus led the questioning, his tone professionally cordial but with an undercurrent of steel that suggested he was being polite through significant effort. Sergeant Reeves, we're trying to understand the sequence of events that led to Her Majesty's unprecedented intervention. Walk us through your tactical assessment of the situation at Junction Point 7. Kai did, keeping his report clinical and precise the way his training had taught him. He described the Kresh assault, the breakdown in communications, the tactical importance of Junction Point 7 as the convergence of evacuation routes. He didn't mention the fear, the certainty that he was about to die, the sound of children crying as they boarded the transports, the way Thuris had organized people with calm efficiency even though everyone knew what was coming. Those details weren't tactically relevant, and he suspected this council cared more about tactics than emotions. And at what point did you decide not to follow your retreat orders? Another counselor asked, her voice carrying tones that suggested genuine curiosity rather than accusation. I didn't decide not to follow them, Kai corrected carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone navigating a minefield. I evaluated the tactical situation and determined that the evacuation needed more time. My orders were to hold for 8 minutes. I held for 11 minutes because that's what the situation required. You held for 11 minutes against overwhelming force with no support, no reinforcement, and every reasonable expectation of death, the counselor pressed. That seems to exceed the parameters of your orders significantly. The civilians needed 11 minutes, Kai said simply. The orders were to hold the position. The position's value was measured in time bought for evacuation. Following the spirit of the orders required holding until the evacuation was complete, not retreating when the clock said I could. There was a long silence. Kai could feel them evaluating him, trying to understand what he represented, trying to fit his actions into frameworks that made sense to beings who'd spent millennia perfecting the art of calculated decision-making and strategic thinking. Do you understand? Vanirus said quietly, his voice carrying across the chamber with perfect acoustics that made Kai suspect the architecture was designed to amplify certain frequencies. That Her Majesty's intervention has created a significant diplomatic incident. The Stellarium ascendancy does not involve itself in colonial conflicts. We certainly do not risk royal lives for individual soldiers, regardless of their courage or the nobility of their cause. Her actions have prompted questions from a dozen governments, concerns from our own military leadership about precedent and protocol, and speculation about changing policy that could affect the entire balance of power in this sector. I didn't ask her to save me, Kai said, then realized how that sounded and tried to course correct. I mean, I'm grateful she did, obviously, more grateful than I have words for. But I wasn't trying to create a political crisis. I was just trying to give people time to evacuate. If Her Majesty's decision to intervene has caused problems, I don't know what that is, but it wasn't my intention. Intention, another counselor repeated, as if testing the word's weight and finding it insufficient. Yet here we are nonetheless, dealing with consequences that exceed intention by several orders of magnitude. The interrogation, because that's what it was, despite the diplomatic language and the comfortable seating and the offer of refreshments that Kai had been too nervous to accept, continued for hours. They asked about his background, his training, his understanding of stellarium culture and politics. They asked about his decision-making process, his assessment of the Kresh threat, his relationship with the colonists he'd protected. They were trying to find an angle, Kai realized, some explanation that made sense within their framework of calculated decisions and political strategy. What they couldn't seem to accept was that he'd simply done what needed doing, without calculation or expectation of reward, because it was right. Eventually, they dismissed him with instructions to remain available for further consultation, which Kai suspected meant, "Don't leave the ship and try not to cause any more problems while we figure out what to do with you." He returned to his quarters feeling like he'd been through a battle more exhausting than the one against the Kresh, his mind spinning with all the things he'd said, and all the ways he'd probably made everything worse without meaning to. He found Lysandra waiting there, sitting in one of the chairs that had adjusted itself to accommodate her physiology, looking far more relaxed than someone who just upended centuries of diplomatic tradition had any right to be. She'd apparently bypassed every protocol that should prevent an Empress from casually visiting a guest's quarters, and no one had stopped her because, well, she was the Empress and stopping her would require authority that no one aboard actually possessed. "Your Majesty," Kai said, snapping to attention despite his exhaustion, because some reflexes were too deeply ingrained to ignore. "Relax, Sergeant," she said with gentle amusement that somehow made him feel both more and less at ease. "If I wanted formality, I'd stay in my own chambers where people bow every time I sneeze and ask permission before breathing too loudly in my presence." She wasn't wearing her sovereign armor now, just elegant robes that somehow made her seem more approachable while also emphasizing the fundamental difference between them. She was royalty, bred and trained for leadership across 40 cycles, while he was a sergeant who'd gotten lucky and was now way out of his depth. "I heard the council gave you quite the session," she continued, gesturing for him to sit in a way that made it clear this was a suggestion from someone whose suggestions were effectively commands. "Several hours of pointed questions about your tactical decision-making and psychological profile. They're trying to understand why you saved me," Kai said, settling into a chair that immediately adjusted to support his spine in ways that were almost unsettling. "And I think they're disappointed that I don't have a better answer than 'I did my job, and she made a choice I don't fully understand.'" "That's actually a very good answer," Lysandra said. "Better than the elaborate theories my advisors have developed about calculated political gestures and strategic positioning. The truth is often simpler than people want to believe." "So why did you do it? Save me, I mean." Kesvi explained that Empresses don't typically involve themselves in frontier conflicts. Lysandra was quiet for a long moment, her ears angling in directions that Kai was starting to recognize indicated deep thought. 40 cycles ago, when I became Empress, the High Sage gave me a warning. She said that the burden of sovereignty is knowing that every decision affects millions of lives, and that this knowledge would eventually teach me to see people as numbers on strategic displays, rather than individuals with their own inherent value and dignity. That sounds bleak. It is, and for 40 cycles, I told myself it was necessary wisdom. That effective leadership required emotional distance, that I was serving the greater good by maintaining that perspective, by making decisions based on logic rather than sentiment. She turned to face him directly, her golden eyes intense. "And then I watched you fight alone for people you had no obligation to protect, refusing to retreat when retreat was the logical choice, valuing their lives above your own survival, and I realized I'd become exactly what the High Sage warned against. I'd forgotten that the numbers on displays are people, that sometimes the illogical choice is the only moral one, that courage matters even when calculation says it shouldn't." Kai didn't know what to say to that. In the silence, he noticed that her ears were angled toward him in what Kesvi had taught him indicated genuine attention and interest, not just polite engagement. "The council thinks I've made a terrible mistake," she continued, her voice carrying something that might have been defiance or might have been uncertainty. That I've set a precedent that will be exploited, that I've shown weakness by valuing individual life over strategic position, that I've compromised the ascendancy's carefully maintained neutrality for sentiment. Perhaps they're right. Perhaps this will have consequences I can't anticipate. Do you regret it? Kai asked, the question emerging before he could consider whether it was appropriate to ask an empress if she regretted saving his life. Not for a moment, she said, and the certainty in her voice surprised them both. Though I suspect the coming weeks will test that conviction repeatedly. But Sergeant Reeves, understand this. You reminded me of something I'd forgotten. Something fundamental about what power should be used for. And whatever consequences follow from that reminder, they're worth bearing. They talked for another hour, the conversation ranging from tactical analysis of the Kresh assault to philosophical discussions about duty and courage, to the small absurdities of their very different upbringings. Kai learned that Lysandra had been trained for sovereignty from birth, her entire life shaped by expectations and protocols that he couldn't begin to imagine. She learned that he joined the military because working maintenance on orbital stations had felt like slow suffocation, each day identical to the last, his future stretching out in comfortable, crushing predictability. So you volunteered for frontier service to escape boredom? She asked, something like understanding in her voice. I volunteered because I wanted my life to mean something, Kai corrected. Turns out fighting the Kresh and holding evacuation points definitely qualifies as meaningful, though the definition might be more literal than I'd planned. Despite everything, Lysandra laughed, a genuine sound that transformed her features from regal authority to someone who seemed almost human in her amusement. Be careful what you wish for, as your people say. You wanted meaning, and now you're at the center of a diplomatic crisis that's reshaping galactic politics. I have terrible judgment, Kai agreed. It's one of my defining features. Over the following days, Kai began to understand the scope of the political storm Lysandra had created. Other governments were demanding explanations for the Ascendancy's intervention, wanting to know if this represented a policy change or an isolated incident. The Stellarium military was concerned about precedent, worried that the Empress's actions would encourage risky behavior or undermine chain of command. There were factions within the Ascendancy itself, who saw Lysandra's choice as either a dangerous departure from tradition or an inspiring return to older values of honor and protection that had been lost in millennia of careful neutrality. Through it all, Lysandra handled the pressure with grace that Kai found himself admiring despite having no framework for understanding what she was actually doing. She met with delegations, crafted careful diplomatic responses, and never once suggested that saving him had been a mistake, even when doing so would simplify her political position enormously. They fell into an unexpected routine. After formal meetings and diplomatic sessions, Lysandra often found her way to wherever Kai was, the observation deck where he watched stars wheel past, the training facilities where he tried to maintain some semblance of fitness, the library where he attempted to learn about Stellarium culture through texts that assumed far more background knowledge than he possessed. Their conversations became the highlight of his days, moments of genuine connection amid the strangeness of living aboard a sovereign vessel, where he was simultaneously honored guest and walking political problem. You know, he said one evening, finding her in the observation deck after a particularly grueling diplomatic session that Kesvi had briefed him about in whispered tones, back on Terexis Minor, I was just trying to make it through each day. Do my job, help where I could, maybe make a small difference in people's lives. And now? She asked, settling into the seat beside him, close enough that he could see the weariness in her features that she hid from everyone else. Now I'm somehow involved in reshaping galactic politics while having regular conversations with an Empress who saved my life for reasons I still don't fully understand. It's surreal. How you've changed, Lysandra observed with gentle humor. from small differences to large ones, though I'd argue that what you did at Junction Point 7 was never small, regardless of scale. 4,317 people evacuated successfully because you refused to retreat. That's not a small difference. That's 4,317 lives that matter individually and collectively. But when you put it that way, it sounds almost heroic. Because it was. The council doesn't want to acknowledge that because it complicates their narrative about calculated decision-making and strategic thinking. But courage is courage regardless of whether it fits their frameworks. The turning point came when news arrived that the Creche had launched a major offensive across 3 systems, including preparations for a second assault on Terexis Minor. The Colonial Defense Force was overwhelmed, civilian casualties were mounting, and the galactic community was fragmenting over how to respond, some governments advocating intervention, others maintaining strict neutrality, most simply paralyzed by committee decisions and political calculations. In her private chambers, Lysandra faced a choice that would define her reign. The council advocated non-intervention, maintaining the ascendancy's traditional neutrality, offering humanitarian aid after the fact but no direct military involvement. It was the safe choice, the logical choice, the choice that preserved carefully maintained political positions and avoided the complications of taking sides. But she'd seen what non-intervention cost now. She'd seen it measured in individuals rather than strategic positions. She'd seen it in the face of a human soldier who'd chosen courage over calculation. She summoned Kai to her strategic planning room. When he arrived, escorted by guards who treated him with a strange mixture of respect and uncertainty, he found her standing before a holographic display that showed the scope of the crisis. Entire worlds threatened, millions of lives hanging in balance, and the galactic community's response dissolving into political theater while people died. "I'm going to intervene," she said without preamble, her voice carrying certainty that allowed no doubt. "Fully, officially. I'm going to commit ascendancy forces to stopping the Creche offensive, and I'm going to do it in a way that will permanently alter our role in galactic politics. The Council will object. Some may even attempt to remove me from power. But I didn't become Empress to maintain comfortable neutrality while people die because of political calculations." "They'll fight you on this," Kai said, understanding the weight of what she was proposing. "Let them. You showed me that courage without calculation still exists. Now I'm going to show the galaxy what happens when an empire remembers its own values. When power is used to protect rather than merely to preserve comfortable positions." She looked at him, and there was something fierce in her expression that reminded him of the warrior who'd fought beside him at Junction Point 7. "But I need your help. I'm just a sergeant. What can I possibly be what you were at Junction Point 7, she interrupted. "Be someone who fights for people, not politics. Help me remember why this matters when the easy path looks tempting. And perhaps, if you're willing, help me build something better than what we had before, an ascendancy that uses its power for protection rather than just observation." Kai realized he was being offered something unprecedented, not just a role in a political transformation, but genuine partnership with someone who terrified and inspired him in equal measure. Someone who descended from orbit because she remembered that individuals mattered. "I'm willing," he said, the words feeling inadequate but true. "Though I should warn you that my diplomatic skills are terrible, and I'll probably cause at least 3 interstellar incidents before I figure out what I'm doing." "I'll take courage over diplomacy," Lysandra said. "We have plenty of diplomats. What we need are people who remember why any of this matters." And as she began outlining her plans for intervention, for transformation, for building an ascendancy that protected rather than merely observed, Kai felt something shift in his understanding of what the future might hold. He'd thought saving those civilians at Junction Point 7 was the end of his story, a good death in a worthy cause. Instead, it had been the beginning of something he couldn't have imagined, a partnership that would reshape his life and possibly the galaxy itself, all because an Empress had looked down from orbit and chosen not to let him die alone. The Stellarium High Council's emergency session began at dawn, though dawn was a somewhat arbitrary concept aboard the Eternal Radiance, where time was measured by ship cycles rather than planetary rotation. Kai watched from the observation gallery, a space designed for witnesses to council proceedings, his presence there courtesy of Lysandra's explicit instructions, despite the objections of at least 7 different protocol officers who tried to explain why allowing a human soldier to observe sovereign deliberations was unprecedented and potentially catastrophic. The Empress has made her position clear, Kesvi had explained earlier that morning, his ears twitching with barely controlled anxiety as he helped Kai prepare for what promised to be a very long and very contentious session. But you need to understand the opposition she's facing. High Chancellor Vanirus represents the traditionalist faction, who believe the ascendancy's strength comes from careful neutrality. Minister Thelvas leads the reformists who have been advocating for more active engagement for decades. And then there are about 40 other counselors with their own positions, alliances, and agendas, all of which are about to collide in a debate that could reshape our entire civilization. No pressure, Kai had muttered, and Kesvi had looked at him with confusion until he explained it was a human idiom, at which point Kesvi had made a note on his data pad about human communication being unnecessarily complicated. Now, watching the council chamber fill with beings whose combined age probably exceeded human civilization's entire existence, Kai felt the weight of what was about to happen. This wasn't just about military intervention or stopping the Kresh offensive. This was about the fundamental question of what the Stellarium ascendancy represented: isolationist observers maintaining comfortable neutrality, or an active force using their power to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Lysandra entered the chamber with royal bearing that commanded immediate silence. She wore ceremonial robes that marked this as a formal proceeding, their surfaces displaying patterns that shifted with her movements, traditional designs that carried centuries of meaning. But Kai could see the tension in the set of her shoulders. The way her ears angled slightly forward in what he'd learned indicated determination, mixed with anticipation of conflict. "Honored Council," she began, her voice carrying the harmonic overtones of formal address. "I have summoned this emergency session to inform you of a decision that will reshape our role in galactic affairs. Effective immediately, I am committing Ascendancy military forces to intervention in the Kresh offensive currently threatening 3 systems and approximately 18 billion lives." The chamber erupted. Counselors spoke over each other, voices rising in shock and outrage, and, in a few cases, what sounded like approval. High Chancellor Vanirus remained seated, his expression carefully controlled, but Kai could see his ears cycling through positions that suggested he was either very angry or very stressed, or possibly both simultaneously. "Your Majesty," Vanirus said once he'd managed to restore order through sheer force of authority, "this decision requires council approval. The commitment of Ascendancy military forces to foreign conflicts is not within your sole discretion." "I am invoking sovereign emergency powers," Lysandra interrupted, her voice carrying absolute authority that allowed no argument. "Under the Accords of Unification, the Empress retains the right to commit forces when civilian populations face imminent existential threat, and the Council is unable to reach consensus in time to prevent catastrophic loss of life. I submit that approximately 18 billion lives qualify as both civilian and facing imminent existential threat. The emergency powers were designed for threats to the Ascendancy itself," another counselor objected, "not for intervention in conflicts that don't directly affect our interests." "Then perhaps our interests need to expand," Lysandra said quietly, but her words carried across the chamber with perfect acoustics. "For too long, we have defined our interests narrowly. What affects our territory, our trade, our immediate security? But we exist in a galaxy where our actions or inactions have consequences that ripple outward. The question before this council is whether we continue to pretend that neutrality absolves us of responsibility for those consequences. Minister Thelvas stood, his expression thoughtful rather than angry. Your Majesty raises important questions about our role and responsibilities, but the practical concerns remain. Committing our forces sets a precedent. Every conflict, every crisis, every government will demand our intervention. How do we decide where to act and where to maintain neutrality? How do we avoid being drawn into endless wars? By establishing clear criteria, Lysandra answered. I propose a protection doctrine. The ascendancy intervenes when civilian populations face existential threats, when local forces are insufficient to prevent catastrophic loss of life, and when our intervention can make a decisive difference. Not every conflict meets these criteria, but the current Kresh offensive does, and our failure to act would be a moral abdication disguised as political prudence. Moral abdication, Vainirus repeated, his voice carrying an edge. Your Majesty speaks of morality as if it supersedes millennia of carefully developed political philosophy. Our neutrality has kept the ascendancy stable, prosperous, and secure through countless galactic conflicts. You propose to abandon that stability for sentiment. I propose to remember that stability purchased through the suffering of others is not morality. It's comfort masquerading as wisdom, Lysandra said. And Kai saw several counselors react with surprise at the directness of her response. High Chancellor, you speak of our neutrality as if it exists in a vacuum. But every choice to not act is itself an action with consequences. We maintained neutrality during the Vorlathi purges and 3 billion died. We maintained neutrality during the Centauri collapse and watched an entire civilization fragment into warring factions that still haven't recovered. At what point does our comfortable observation become complicity? The debate continued for hours. Kai watched counselors argue about resources, precedent, political ramifications, and strategic positioning. He watched Lysandra respond to each objection with arguments that balanced moral imperative with practical considerations. And he watched as the council slowly, reluctantly, began to shift, not all of them, but enough that the balance of opinion was changing. During a recess, Kesvi found Kai in the observation gallery with refreshments and what Kai was starting to recognize as gossip disguised as cultural briefing. The traditionalist bloc is fracturing, Kesvi said in hushed tones, his ears swiveling to ensure no one was listening. Counselor Myrthania just broke ranks to support the protection doctrine, and she brings 6 aligned votes with her. That puts the Empress within 3 votes of a majority if this goes to formal vote, though she's still claiming emergency powers that bypass the vote entirely. Why claim emergency powers if she's close to a majority? Because emergency powers establish that this is within sovereign discretion, not subject to council veto. If she wins a vote, it sets precedent that the council must approve all interventions. If she claims emergency authority and they don't challenge it, it establishes that sovereign discretion includes protective intervention. The political implications are, Kesvi paused, searching for words, complicated in ways that would take several hours to fully explain. Politics is exhausting, Kai muttered. Yes, but effective. Warfare is simple, you identify enemies and eliminate them. Politics requires convincing people who disagree with you to support your position anyway, which is considerably more difficult than shooting them. When the session resumed, Vainirus made his move. Your Majesty, the Council respectfully requests that you submit to a vote of sovereignty. If your position truly has the support you claim, the vote will confirm your authority. If it does not, then perhaps the Council's reservations have merit. It was a trap, and Kai could see it even if he didn't fully understand the nuances. A vote of sovereignty was essentially a vote of confidence. If Lysandra won, she was validated, but if she lost, Her authority was undermined enough that she might face formal challenges to her reign. Lysandra was quiet for a long moment, and Kai could see her calculating, weighing options, considering consequences. Then she did something that surprised everyone, including, Kai suspected, herself. "I accept the council's request," she said, "but with a condition. Before we vote on my authority, I want you to hear from someone whose perspective we've been missing. Someone who understands the cost of our comfortable neutrality in ways that no amount of political philosophy can capture." She gestured toward the observation gallery, toward Kai, and suddenly every eye in the chamber was on him. "Sergeant Kai Reeves," she said, her voice formal and resonant, "please address the council." Kai's brain short-circuited. He'd been shot at, nearly killed, fought against overwhelming odds, and survived. But none of that had prepared him for being asked to speak to a governing body that controlled the fate of trillions and whose collective age made him feel like a mayfly commenting on mountains. Kesvi, who'd gone absolutely pale, whispered, "Oh no," with feeling. But Lysandra was looking at him with an expression that said she believed he could do this, that his perspective mattered, that sometimes the outsider view was exactly what was needed to cut through entrenched positions. Kai stood, his legs feeling shaky, and made his way down to the council floor. The walk felt like it took forever, every step echoing in a chamber designed to amplify the sounds of authority and make individuals feel appropriately insignificant. When he reached the center, standing where Lysandra had stood hours before, he looked up at rows of counselors watching him with expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility to something that might have been hope. "I don't know anything about stellarium politics," he began, his voice rough compared to their melodic speech. "I don't understand your traditions or your history or your complicated reasons for staying out of conflicts that don't directly affect you. But I know what it feels like to watch people die when you could have saved them. I know what it costs to make the calculation that some lives matter more than others, because they're more convenient or less politically complicated to protect." He took a breath, gathering his thoughts. 3 days ago, I was preparing to die at Junction Point 7. I'd made the calculation that my life was worth trading for time, time for civilians to evacuate, time for children to reach safety, time for people I'd never met to have a chance at living. And I made that trade willingly, because the alternative was watching them die when I could have done something. The Empress made a similar calculation, he continued, looking directly at Lysandra. She risked her life, her political position, her comfortable neutrality, because she saw someone fighting alone and chose not to let him die. She could have calculated that one human soldier wasn't worth the political crisis. She could have stayed in orbit and maintained your comfortable observation. But she didn't, because she remembered something you seem to have forgotten, that every number on your strategic displays is a person. That 4,317 evacuated civilians isn't a statistic. It's individual lives with their own value and dignity. "You're debating whether to intervene to stop the Kresh offensive," he said, his voice growing stronger. "You're worried about precedent and resources and political complications. But while you debate, people are dying. Not statistics, not numbers on displays. People like Thuris, who runs a bakery and has 4 arms and makes terrible jokes. People like the kids I taught human football to who thought the rules were hilarious. People whose names I'll never know but who matter just as much as anyone in this chamber. Your Empress is offering you a choice," Kai said quietly. "You can maintain your comfortable neutrality and preserve your political positions while millions die. Or you can remember what power is actually for, not to observe from safety, but to protect those who can't protect themselves. Not to calculate who's worth saving based on political convenience, but to act because it's right." He paused, meeting the eyes of counselors who were probably ancient when his species was learning to make fire. "I'm just a sergeant. I don't have your wisdom or your experience or your sophisticated understanding of galactic politics. But I know that when I stood at Junction Point 7, I had a choice, retreat to safety or fight for people who needed me. And I know that when your Empress looked down from orbit, she had a choice: maintain comfortable neutrality or descend to help someone fighting alone. We both made the hard choice, the dangerous choice, the choice that put principle above calculation. Now you get to make that same choice, but on a scale that matters to billions instead of thousands. Choose wisely. The silence that followed was absolute. Kai stood there, acutely aware that he just lectured beings who could have him removed from the ship with a gesture, feeling his heart hammer against his ribs, wondering if he just made everything catastrophically worse. Then Minister Thelvas stood, his expression thoughtful. The human makes a compelling argument, albeit one that challenges fundamental assumptions we've held for millennia, but perhaps those assumptions needed challenging. This is not about challenging assumptions, Vanurus objected. This is about sustainable policy, about whether we can actually commit to protecting every threatened population in the galaxy without exhausting our resources and destabilizing the very order that keeps the peace. Then we establish limits, another counselor suggested. The protection doctrine, as Her Majesty outlined, clear criteria for when we intervene. Not every conflict, but those meeting specific thresholds of civilian threat and our capacity to make a difference. The debate resumed, but something had shifted. Kai could feel it even if he couldn't articulate exactly what had changed. His words had broken through something, had forced them to confront the reality behind their political abstractions. The vote, when it finally came, was closer than Lysandra had hoped, but more decisive than the traditionalists had feared. The protection doctrine was approved. The Empress's authority to commit forces under sovereign emergency powers was confirmed, and the Stellarium Ascendancy's role in galactic affairs was fundamentally transformed. After the session concluded, after counselors had dispersed to process what had just happened, Lysandra found Kai sitting alone in the observation gallery, staring at stars and trying to process the fact that he just helped reshape the political structure of an interstellar empire. That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the most reckless, she said, settling into the seat beside him. Can it be both? Kai asked, echoing his words from Junction Point 7, and she actually laughed. Apparently so. You have a gift for making the impossible routine. She was quiet for a moment, watching the same stars. Thank you, for saying what I couldn't, for cutting through the political complexity to the fundamental truth, for reminding them why any of this matters. I probably violated about 40 different protocols, Kai said. Undoubtedly. Kesvi is probably writing a report about it right now. But you also changed minds that I couldn't reach through conventional arguments. Sometimes the outsider perspective is exactly what's needed. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the galaxy wheel past, two people from different worlds who'd found common ground in the belief that some things transcended calculation. What happens now? Kai asked eventually. Now we prove this works, Lysandra said. We intervene in the Kresh offensive. We establish that the protection doctrine isn't just philosophy but practical policy. We build alliances with governments who share our values, and we face opposition from those who preferred the old order. She looked at him, her golden eyes serious. It won't be easy. There will be mistakes, overreach, situations where intervention makes things worse. But at least we'll be trying instead of just observing. I'm in, Kai said, for whatever comes next. Though I should warn you that I'm terrible at politics, and I'll probably cause at least 7 more incidents before I figure out what I'm doing. I'm counting on it, Lysandra said with a smile. The incidents, I mean. Sometimes disruption is exactly what's needed to prevent comfortable stagnation. And as the Eternal Radiance prepared to deploy forces to stop the Kresh offensive, as the galaxy began to process what the Ascendancy's transformation meant, as two unlikely allies prepared to build something better than what had existed before, Kai thought about the strange path that had brought him here. From a maintenance platform to Junction Point 7 to reshaping galactic politics. From expecting to die alone to standing beside an empress who'd chosen not to let him. The universe had a strange sense of humor. But maybe, just maybe, it also had a sense of justice. The campaign against the Kresh offensive lasted 6 weeks and became the stuff of military legend, analyzed in tactical academies across Allied space for years afterward. Ascendancy forces, coordinated with colonial defense and Allied militaries, pushed back the invasion with precision that stunned observers, who'd assumed the Stellarium military was primarily for show, decorative peacekeepers who'd forgotten how to actually fight. Those observers learned very quickly that millennia of peace hadn't made the ascendancy soft. It had just made them selective about when to demonstrate their capabilities. Kai watched much of it from the Eternal Radiance, though Lysandra occasionally brought him to strategic planning sessions where his ground combat perspective provided insights that fleet commanders sometimes missed. He was present when they liberated Terexis Minor for the second time, watching through tactical displays as Ascendancy forces coordinated with human defenders to drive the Kresh off-world permanently. He received a message from Thuris 3 days after the liberation, transmitted through the still-damaged communications network. It was rambling, enthusiastic, contained at least 3 marriage proposals from various species who'd heard about the human who held the line, several invitations to dinner when he returned, and a promise of free cinnamon rolls that weren't quite cinnamon rolls for life. Reading it made Kai laugh until his sides hurt, the kind of laughter that came from relief and joy, and the surreal awareness that he'd somehow survived everything that should have killed him. "You're crying," Lysandra observed, finding him in his quarters reading the message for the 3rd time. "They're offering me free breakfast for life," Kai said, wiping his eyes. "Do you understand what that means to a soldier who's been eating military rations for 3 years? That your species has unusual priorities," she suggested with gentle humor, "that they're alive to make the offer. That Thuris is still running his bakery. That the kids I taught football to are still around to think the rules are hilarious. That 4,317 people are living their lives because we made the hard choice." Something softened in Lysandra's expression, her ears angling toward him in what he'd learned indicated affection and understanding. "The protection doctrine saved them. You saved them first, at junction point 7, but the doctrine ensures it can be repeated across the galaxy. That's the difference between individual courage and systemic change. Both matter, but one creates lasting impact. But the military victory was only the beginning. The real transformation came in what Lysandra did afterward, in the weeks and months following the successful intervention. She didn't just stop at military action. She rebuilt the damaged colonies, established refugee support systems, and most importantly, she formalized the protection doctrine into actual policy with clear criteria, resource allocation, and oversight mechanisms. The galaxy watched with a mixture of awe, suspicion, and hope as the Stellarium Ascendancy transformed from isolationist observers to active protectors. Some governments applauded it, seeing the Ascendancy as a bulwark against aggressor species like the Kresh. Others viewed it with suspicion, worried about what happened when the most powerful empire in the sector decided it had the right to intervene anywhere. And still others simply waited to see if this transformation would last or fade when the political complications became too expensive. Kai settled into his role as personal military advisor to the Empress, a position that had been created specifically for him, and which existed in a strange space between formal military structure and diplomatic service. It meant he attended strategy sessions with fleet admirals, diplomatic negotiations with foreign governments, and policy discussions about intervention criteria. It also meant he had no clear chain of command, no established protocols, and had to figure out his responsibilities mostly through trial and error. "You're essentially inventing your job as you go," Kesvi explained one day, having somehow transitioned from anxious aide to something resembling a friend. which is terrifying from a bureaucratic perspective but apparently effective from a practical one. I have no idea what I'm doing most of the time, Kai admitted. Yes, but you're honest about it, which is surprisingly refreshing in government service. Most people pretend certainty even when they're completely lost. Your willingness to say, "I don't know, but let's figure it out," has actually become influential in how policy discussions happen. The first major test of Kai's role came during the Kashan dispute, a territorial conflict between two allied governments that was threatening to escalate into full warfare. The Kashan government claimed they faced existential threat and demanded ascendancy intervention under the protection doctrine. The Thurin government countered that this was a border dispute being manipulated to force intervention on Kasha's behalf. Kai sat in on the diplomatic sessions, watching government representatives make their cases with rhetoric that seemed designed to obscure as much as it revealed. The counselors debated criteria, questioned definitions of existential threat, and generally tied themselves in knots trying to determine if this situation met the protection doctrine's requirements. Finally, Kai spoke up, interrupting a particularly complex argument about historical precedent. "Can I ask a simple question? Are civilians actually dying?" The Kashan ambassador looked at him with an expression that suggested the question was too simple to be relevant. "The conflict has resulted in some civilian casualties, yes, but the real threat is the territorial incursion that could." "How many civilians have died?" Kai pressed. "Approximately 400 in the past month, but..." "And how many are at risk if the conflict escalates to full warfare?" "Estimates vary, but potentially tens of thousands across both territories if..." "Then the answer is yes, civilians are dying and more are at risk." Kai looked at the counselors, several of whom were watching him with interest. "The protection doctrine exists to prevent civilian casualties. Everything else, territorial rights, historical claims, political positioning, that's what diplomacy is for. If we can stop the fighting through diplomatic pressure backed by the threat of intervention, we protect civilians without actually having to fight. Isn't that the best possible outcome?" Minister Thelvas, who'd become something of an ally, nodded thoughtfully. "The human cuts through complexity admirably. Perhaps we've been overcomplicating the question. The doctrine exists to protect people, not to adjudicate territorial disputes. We can offer protection while negotiating resolution." The solution they ultimately developed, ascendancy peacekeepers monitoring both sides while diplomats negotiated, became a template for future interventions. It wasn't perfect, but it prevented escalation and saved lives without requiring full military commitment. "You're getting better at this," Lysandra told him after the Kashan settlement was announced. "The political navigation, the policy discussions. You're learning to speak the language even while maintaining your outsider perspective." "I still feel like I'm making it up as I go," Kai admitted. "Good. The moment you stop feeling that way is the moment you've become too comfortable with power. Uncertainty keeps you honest." The first anniversary of Junction Point 7 arrived with startling speed. Lysandra had declared it the Day of Courage, a holiday commemorating not just that specific battle, but the principle it represented, that individual acts of selfless bravery ripple outward to change empires. The announcement was broadcast across Allied space, billions watching as she spoke from the Ascendancy capital. Kai stood beside her on the platform, acutely aware of the crowd gathered below and the cameras transmitting their images to worlds he'd never visited. He'd been shot at and nearly killed, but somehow this, standing in public view as a symbol of something larger than himself, felt more terrifying than combat. "A year ago," Lysandra said, her voice carrying across the plaza and beyond, "one human soldier made a choice that changed the course of galactic history. Sergeant Kai Reeves chose to value other lives above his own survival, to fight alone for people he had no obligation to protect, to hold a position that every tactical assessment said was indefensible. That choice reminded an empire what we'd forgotten, that individuals matter, that courage transcends calculation, that some principles are worth fighting for regardless of odds. She gestured to him, and Kai felt millions of eyes focus on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Today, we honor not just Sergeant Reeves, but the principle he represents. We honor every person who chooses courage over calculation, who protects the vulnerable, who fights for what's right rather than what's convenient. And we commit ourselves, as an empire, to supporting that courage with the resources and authority necessary to make it effective. The ceremony continued with formal recognitions, cultural performances, and speeches from government officials across Allied space. But what mattered most to Kai were the messages that arrived afterward, thousands of them, from people across the galaxy who'd been affected by the protection doctrine in its first year, from a Vorlathi family whose colony had been saved by intervention during a pirate raid, from a Centauri scientist whose research station had been protected from corporate warfare, from a human settlement on the frontier that had received aid during a natural disaster, from people he'd never met, whose lives had been touched by a policy that started with one Empress choosing not to let one soldier die alone. 7 interventions in the first year, Lysandra said that evening, finding Kai in the observation deck where he'd retreated after the public ceremonies. 3 successful negotiations backed by intervention threat. Approximately 2 million lives saved that would have been lost under our previous policy of neutrality. The numbers are significant. 2 million people, Kai said quietly. That's not a number. That's 2 million versions of Thuris. 2 million kids learning to play football. 2 million individuals living their lives. Which is exactly why you're effective in this role, Lysandra said, settling into the seat beside him with the comfortable familiarity they'd developed over the past year. You never let me forget that the numbers are people, that every intervention is about individuals with their own stories and value. They sat in comfortable silence, watching stars wheel past the observation port. It had become their unofficial refuge, this space, where they could step away from the demands of policy and politics and simply exist as two people who'd found unexpected partnership. What happens now? Kai asked eventually, the question that seemed to define their relationship. Now we continue, Lysandra said. We refine the doctrine based on what we've learned. We build stronger alliances with governments who share our values. We face opposition from those who preferred the old order, and there's significant opposition, Kai, more than the public ceremonies acknowledge. We make mistakes and learn from them. We prove that this transformation wasn't just idealistic rhetoric, but sustainable policy. Sounds exhausting. It is, which is why I need someone beside me who remembers why we started this. Someone who will tell me when I'm wrong, who cuts through political complexity to fundamental truths, who fights for people instead of positions. She looked at him, and there was vulnerability in her expression that she rarely showed anyone. Someone I trust absolutely, whose judgment I value even when, especially when, it contradicts my own instincts. Kai thought about the path that had brought him here. From a frontier colony to Junction Point 7 to reshaping galactic politics alongside an Empress who descended from orbit to save him. It was absurd, improbable, and somehow exactly right. I'm not going anywhere, he said. Good. Because the Centauri delegation arrives tomorrow, and they're absolutely going to try to exploit the protection doctrine for territorial advantage, claiming their mining dispute constitutes existential threat. And I need you there to call them on it when they inevitably argue that economic threats are equivalent to military ones. Is that what passes for romantic conversation in Stellarium culture? Kai asked, the words emerging before he'd fully considered what he was saying. Lysandra went very still, her ears angling in a direction he'd learned indicated surprise mixed with something he couldn't quite identify. Was that romantic? I thought I was just being practical about tomorrow's diplomatic challenges. You're terrible at this, Kai said, feeling his face heat but pushing forward anyway because apparently he decided now was the time to address the thing they'd been carefully not discussing for months. At recognizing when conversations become something more than professional collaboration. "I'm the Empress of a galactic power," she said, but her voice was quieter than usual, almost uncertain. "I don't need to be good at romance. I have advisors who manage succession planning and alliance marriages, and all the complicated political arrangements that sovereigns are expected to navigate." "And what do you want?" Kai asked. "Not the Empress with her political obligations, but you, Lysandra, the person who descended to a battlefield, because she remembered that individuals matter." She was quiet for a long moment, her golden eyes studying his face with an intensity that made him feel like she was reading his soul. "I want," she finally said, each word chosen with precision, "someone who sees me as a person rather than a political asset. Someone who will argue with me when I'm wrong instead of deferring to royal authority. Someone who makes me remember why power exists, not for comfort or prestige, but for protecting people who can't protect themselves. Someone who—" She trailed off and Kai waited, his heart hammering. "Someone who reminds me what courage looks like," she finished quietly, "every single day." "I can do that," Kai said. "Though I should warn you that getting romantically involved with your military advisor is probably going to cause another political crisis." "At this point, what's one more crisis?" Lysandra said, and there was humor in her voice but also something deeper, something warm that made Kai's breath catch. "Besides, we seem to be good at transforming political crises into institutional change. Perhaps we can make scandalized counselors into progressive policy advocates through sheer force of stubborn principle." "That's a terrible plan. All our best plans are terrible. It seems to be our defining characteristic." They sat closer now, not quite touching but near enough that Kai could feel the warmth radiating from her, could count the subtle shifts in her ear positions that indicated emotions he was still learning to read. Outside, the galaxy continued its ancient dance, indifferent to the small dramas of the beings who lived among its stars. But inside this observation deck, something fundamental had shifted. Not in the grand political sense that would reshape civilizations, but in the smaller, more important sense of two people, acknowledging what had been growing between them since the moment she descended to Junction Point 7 and chosen not to let him die alone. "So," Kai said eventually, because someone had to actually address the practical implications. "What does this mean for tomorrow? For the Centauri negotiations and the policy discussions and all the very serious diplomatic work we're supposed to be doing?" "It means," Lysandra said with a smile that transformed her features from regal authority to something softer and more genuine, "that we face it together, as we've been doing, as we'll continue to do. The only difference is we're acknowledging what we both already knew, that this partnership is more than professional collaboration. The Council is going to have opinions. The Council always has opinions. It's essentially their primary function." She stood, extending a hand to help him up. "Come on, we should probably get some rest before tomorrow's diplomatic circus." And Kai, "Yeah, thank you for being brave enough to fight alone at Junction Point 7. For reminding me what courage looks like. For staying when you could have returned to Terexis Minor and your comfortable obscurity. For being someone I can trust with both political decisions and—" She paused, her ears angling forward in what he'd learned indicated vulnerability. "And with my heart." Kai took her hand, letting her pull him to his feet, and found himself standing close enough to see the flecks of lighter gold in her eyes, close enough to feel her breath against his skin. "Thank you for not letting me die," he said simply, "and for building something that makes that courage matter beyond just one battle." They left the observation deck together, walking side by side through corridors that had become familiar over the past year. And as they went, Kai thought about how strange fate was, how falling off a maintenance platform and crashing into Junction Point 7 and fighting alone against impossible odds had somehow led him here, to partnership with an empress who transformed an empire because she remembered that individuals mattered. The galaxy would continue to challenge them. Opposition to the protection doctrine remained strong in certain quarters. There would be interventions that failed, situations where protection made things worse, endless political battles over resources and criteria, and the fundamental question of what responsibilities came with power. But they'd face it together. A human soldier who'd learned that courage mattered, and a Stellarium Empress who'd learned that calculation without compassion was tyranny in civilized dress. Two people from different worlds who'd found common ground in the simple, radical belief that some things transcended politics. That power existed to protect, not just to preserve comfortable positions. That every individual life had inherent value regardless of species or status or political convenience. And that sometimes, the most important partnerships began with one person choosing not to let another die alone. The universe had a strange sense of humor, Kai thought, but maybe, just maybe, it also had a sense of justice, and perhaps even a sense of hope, the kind of hope that said the future could be better than the past if people were brave enough to build it. Together,